So participants are in.
Yep, the numbers, you'll see the numbers climb very quickly. So,
Yeah.
yeah. I think it would be a good idea to ask everyone to turn off their microphones.
Okay.
All the
You
participants.
can mute them all.
Oh, you can? Yeah.
Yes.
Oh. Are we ready to begin? I can't hear anything at all now.
Yes. Let's start.
Okay. So good day, everybody. Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, or wherever you happen to be. And welcome back to the second online webinar on trade and the Sustainable Development Goals, organised by UN ESCAP under the incredibly capable leadership of Witada Anukun Wataka, who is, of course, right here on your screen as well, or at least I hope so. So thanks, Witada, for organising everything. Today we have a 90-minute session. We're going to try to end exactly on time. So I'm going to begin with a very brief introduction, including an introduction to the special guests that we have today on our panel. And then, as last time, I'm going to throw everything open for questions and answers from the floor. So let me begin by sharing my screen and going through just very quickly, reminding us what we have on our plate today. So this is a course on trade and the Sustainable Development Goals. I'm sorry, my phone is ringing at the same time. It's a bit distracting. Trade and the Sustainable Development Goals. Here are the Sustainable Development Goals. Of course, you know all about those. And here are the two really fundamental questions that are being addressed in this course. The first is, what are the fundamental links between trade and the Sustainable Development Goals? And the second, does trade help or hinder efforts to attain the SDGs? And of course, the reason why we have a course on this at all is because just looking at the world and looking at data doesn't always tell us exactly what we need to know about these links between trade and the SDGs, because so many of those links are indirect or even implicit, hard to measure directly. So the course really focuses on trying to build the toolkit that we need in order to be able to see what those implicit or indirect linkages look like. Okay, so I said we had a panel of specialists today. Here they are. Excuse me, just one moment. I'm sorry, I can't talk now. Can you call back in 2 hours? Thank you. So apologies for that. So today on our panel, we have Witada herself. She's here and she's at UN ESCAP and she's a specialist on trade facilitation and trade and investment. Alberto Pozo from Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology, a specialist in poverty and inequality. Biswajit Nag from the Indian Institute of Foreign Trade, a specialist in global value chains and business. Alexei Kravchenko from ESCAP also, a specialist in environment and climate change. And we have Pasakon from Thammasat University, a specialist in agriculture and natural resources. Unfortunately, Evelyn Davadason is unable to join us today. She was in Vietnam last week, and it sounds like she may have picked up that disease that we're not going to talk about if we don't have to. So Evelyn cannot join us. Okay, really quickly, here is a very quick 2-slide overview of the advanced modules, the subject matter for today's online webinar. There are B modules and C modules, and within B there are 4 categories. The first, trade, poverty, hunger, and inclusive growth. And the 3 modules in there you already have seen. How does trade affect poverty and inequality? Should we use trade policy to address hunger? And does trade lead to inclusive growth? Under climate change and sustainable growth, we have a module on trade and climate change and the environment, and another one on trade and intergenerational mobility. In B3, we turn our attention to trade and the several of the other SDGs, including that that concerned with decent work, that one associated with innovation, and also the SDGs that address responsible consumption and production. So does trade lead to a race to the bottom in labor standards? Does trade cause productivity growth or innovation? And how does trade interact with efforts to improve responsible production and consumption? Finally, in the B modules, the big policy and institutions module, achieving the trade we want, which talks about the WTO, about free trade agreements and other trade institutions, and the role of non-government actors in that as well. Lastly, in the C modules, we have two supplementary modules, one on trade and health, and the other on issues in trade and global value chains. So that's just a quick reminder of what the content is that we're addressing today. And the way we're going to do it is you have questions or you want to discuss points. We're going to ask you to put those in the chat. We'll pick them up out of the chat. We will then ask you to unmute and discuss or address your question with us so that we can provide such answers or reflections on your question as are possible. I want to begin with one question, at least maybe two, that were already posted in the chat after our last session. The first of these came from Luck Governor. I don't know whether Luck you are online or not today, but if you are, please get ready to unmute. The question there was, in terms of SDG 2, ending hunger and achieving food security, how do countries correct and prevent trade restrictions and distortions in the agricultural market, including parallel elimination of all forms of agricultural export subsidies and to equate export measures? So that's a question which uses language right out of the SDG document. So I guess it's a question which is asking us to say a little more clearly what that language in the SDG document is really trying to say. And for this, I'm going to throw the question directly to our poverty and inequality specialist, Alberto. So Alberto, you have thoughts about that question?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Ian, and apologies, everyone. I'm getting over a cold, so I might have to stop and do some coughing along the way. So this is a good question in the sense that it gets to, it's sort of a huge question. There's a lot to unpack here. So the first one is sort of the relationship between trade and food security. So let's think about an example. Imagine you are a country like Ethiopia or Nigeria, and you're producing, say, wheat or rice, and you notice that you're about 70% self-sufficient. So that means that while you may be producing, you're still importing quite a lot. And take the case of Ethiopia. So Ethiopia is sort of Africa's main wheat exporter. So what they would do is say, well, we are producing a lot of wheat, but it's still not enough to meet our national consumption standards of what we need to eat. So what can we use trade policy here to achieve that goal? So even though a country like Ethiopia might be a net importer, it doesn't mean it's not exporting. So one of the first things a country might want to do, like Ethiopia, is say, which they did, by the way, in the mid 2000s, is say, hey, let's stop all exports of wheat, and then let's consume that at home right now. So now imagine your demand and supply diagram from like microeconomics 1, and you have your export prices, which is going to be above the equilibrium price. You're basically telling the economy, we're going to be somewhere below this equilibrium price. What happens is on the demand side, there's more consumption, but on the supply side, there's less production because we're not exporting. So now we potentially meet our wheat constraints. Economists would then highlight at least one major problem with this. if we are net importers of wheat, and if we have been for a while, then perhaps as Ethiopians, which is what we are in this case, we're exporting. We're very good at growing other things, and we're using those exports. And I just looked that up before. So the Ethiopia's main export is coffee. So we're using coffee exports here to basically pay for that wheat from overseas. So what we'd understand here is that we'd have a comparative advantage in coffee. And so we should stick to that, get the money from that thing, and then use that money to buy wheat. The idea here is that there's no reason why food security is not necessarily linked to trade. Trade can be a conduit by which we achieve food security, but we have to remember that we don't have to produce all the stuff we're going to eat at home. That is going to be a function of what we're good at growing, what we can produce at home, and sometimes we just can't produce a lot of this stuff. So let's get it from another country instead. And I think that's the lessons we've seen over and over and over again from a lot of countries that have tried to restrict those imports. Now, having said that, there are, of course, short-term costs and issues with, say, exporting coffee. Coffee is a commodity. There's prices going up and down all the time. Those prices can go down. If those prices go down, then I can afford a lot less wheat. And it doesn't preclude countries. So that's obviously a bad thing. We have to sort of diversify our exports so that we're not subjected to those negative shocks. That is going to build resilience in the long run. But the idea here is let's not stop exporting what we're good at. Let's continue doing that and buy some extra wheat. And the other thing is, of course, we don't have any reason to stop countries in trying to invest in strategic things like wheat that we might think can grow in our country if we just use the right seeds and the right technology. And in fact, this is what Ethiopia has been doing in the past, and its productivity has gone from being pretty flat in the wheat sector to increasing. Now, will become a huge exporter. Well, as a result of the excuse me, the Ukrainian the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the rise of exports of prices of wheat internationally, we do have now this important issue where we could think that investing in technologies to guarantee food security in this space can be potentially an important thing, but that again doesn't mean that we should sort of bank on that. The idea is diversification, continue to export what we can, but let's not stop from investing in technologies that could lead to higher production of certain goods when it makes sense to do so. And generally, producers are pretty good at figuring that sort of stuff out. So that's, I guess, a broad answer, Ian. I hope I covered all
Yeah.
the key points.
Thanks, Alberto. And you used the case of export restrictions, but of course on the import restriction side, there's a lot of not only efficiency issues of the kind that you were raising, but also equity issues. If your country is a net food importer, as for example Indonesia is, and module B12 talks about this, then when you restrict imports, you raise the domestic price. And by raising the domestic price, that's good for the bigger farmers, of course. They get a higher price at the farm gate. But everybody else who is a net consumer of food is made worse off. And what a lot of people fail to realize often is that that also includes many small farmers, because they may grow food, but they don't grow enough food to feed themselves all year round. When food prices rise, that also makes them worse off. So the module covers those issues, and I think that the poverty and inequality component of food trade policy is a very direct connection from food trade policies through to the SDGs. Pasakon or anyone else, did you want to jump in and add anything to that?
Yes, Ian, and I would like to share my thoughts. Like after, I think Alberto and you already made a good point from different example, like Alberto stressed on the export ban, and you also raise up the point of import restriction. I think this issue has become like at our interest again because of the recent crisis, the outbreak of COVID-19, and also the Ukraine war that forced, and we see the real example that several governments around the world had choose to impose some restriction or trade barrier in a short run. And I think once we hear the news that specific country announced that they're going to impose the export ban or the import ban, something like that. I think my feeling is mixed, but as an economist, I'm sure that I strongly support that this is not the direction that to solve the real problem, because it only can probably in the short run can have the short run impact. But in the long run, as you point out, Ian, and also Alberto, that there is a consequence of implementing this kind of policy, that from the export ban, like once you make the domestic price of the agricultural products going down, but on the other hand, you also have to consider that if the majority of your country are in the agricultural sector and are in the farmers, that would have a strong impact on their income, you know. And I think there may be a consensus that maybe export ban might not be the right policy to help alleviate or solve the problem. But I think we should focus more on the kind of policy that build up the social safety nets. Ian, that's
Yeah.
my point. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, Pasakon. Let's go to another question. We have several in the chat, and we have one or two that were held over from last time as well. One of the questions that we got after the last session had to do with global value chains and trade facilitation agreements, and it linked those to environmental concerns, carbon abatement strategies, for example. So here's a case in which trade has multiple effects, or rather has effects on multiple SDG targets. Trade may be improving income, it may be generating jobs, but it may also be potentially at least generating environmental damages at the same time. So maybe I'll throw this one to you, Alexi, and ask you to talk a little bit about some of the links between trade and broad environmental goals, such as carbon abatement strategies. And maybe Biswajit, you'd like to jump in as well at some point and talk about the global value chain dimension of that.
Thanks very much, Ian. Our latest report that we published, the Asia Pacific Trade Investment Report in 2021, specifically looked at the links between trade and climate change and climate action. And so, typically you actually hear people think that trade is very much part of the problem rather than the solution. Everybody thinks, oh, my apples come from far away, there's shipping involved, and that creates all sorts of problems, all sorts of pollution, and therefore you should buy local, and that's going to be better for the planet. But the problem is that's not always the case. So one of my favorite example coming from New Zealand myself is that in the UK a few years ago, they wanted to promote local meat, saying that we shouldn't buy New Zealand lamb because it's so far away, literally on the other side of the world. You have to ship it over there, huge emissions, very bad for their greenhouse gas emissions. But then they've done some studies. Granted, it was a New Zealand study, but so far I haven't seen any refutation of it, was that, there is less shipping, but typically shipping constitutes only a tiny fraction in that particular market of the overall greenhouse gas emissions. So in the case of the lamb, the one that they looked specifically, they estimated that New Zealand lamb in the UK market produced 4 times fewer greenhouse gas emissions than local UK lamp. And the reason was that in the UK, the climate is colder, the animals need to be heated and be placed in barns during the winter, and they have to have their feed brought into it. Whereas in New Zealand, the sheep graze outside all year round. They graze on naturally grown um, grass, and therefore even if you consider the transportation emissions in there, it is actually very much greener. Yes, there are transport emissions, but there are other considerations. Another example, aluminium, it's a highly greenhouse gas intensive production if you consider electricity generation. And again, if you just are stuck at transport, you wouldn't see that in New Zealand, the largest smelting plant is 100% powered by hydroelectricity, and therefore that's the greenest aluminum it is. Whereas if you buy it from China, which may be closer to you, it is almost exclusively powered by coal burning power plants. Right, this is and it's case by case basis, but most importantly is that trade is very much necessary for dispersion of green technologies. Not everybody has the capacity to build solar panels, wind turbines, and all the necessary things. Without trade, you would expect every single country to produce everything it needs. That's just wouldn't happen.
Thanks, Alexei. Yeah, and in the background of your comment there is also a question that's come up in the chat several times already today, and that is about the role of institutions, because of course if we can produce more cheaply in a country where the production technology is dirty and there's no restriction on that happening, we can have a pollution haven type distribution of global production. So once again, I think one of the very big themes in the course is that if you want to address two targets or two policies at the same time, you're probably going to need more than one instrument to do that. And trade policy alone with weak institutions may lead us to a bad outcome in particular, in terms of environmental SDGs. But your main point, I think, was that from an efficiency perspective, the possibility of trade means that we can allocate parts of the production process around the world to the most efficient producers, and subject to institutions also in many cases the cleanest ones as well. Now, Biswajit, do you have a perspective on that from the business angle, the business side?
Yeah, I fully agree with both of you that a strong institution is very important. Let me just pick up example from electric vehicle, because that actually is also becoming a major point of debate, whether the EVs are actually environmental friendly or actually it's basically dispersing pollutions in some other parts of the world. So there are two issues have come up here. Number one is when you are actually having electric vehicle, it's a greener vehicle. Of course, the pollution is going down. But at the same time, there's a question that from where the battery is coming and what is going to happen at the end of the life cycle of the battery. So, so proper disposal of the used battery is basically a national issue, and also is an issue based on the institutions, how actually they are looking at the overall the environmental or maybe the climate change issues as a whole. Second thing, another debate is here that when we are having an IC engine, so we are actually consuming petroleum or gasoline. So as a result, there's an immediate pollution. But for EV, what is happening? Maybe the electricity points from where actually we're charging the vehicle. So that this electricity may be coming from fossil fuel. So actually, it's polluting in another way. So again, it's the institutional issue, the national issue, that how the country is getting ready for alternative energy in case of solar panel or windmills or whatever it is. And as you have just mentioned, Ian, that not every country is in same position. So there will be possibility of different kinds of trade if you really would like to reduce the production of polluting industries. So if you would like to bring the new technology, new institutions, and a new kind of trade might actually help us to disperse this entire thing.
Yeah, Thanks, Biswajit. That's great. We have a bunch of questions in the chat, and Witada, I know you've been looking at those. Do you want to pick any one of those? Is there one that jumps out as a particularly good question that we should address? I put you on the spot. I'm sorry.
Quite a few.
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I will just strengthen the questions on institutions because it appeared several times there. I think in international trade, the quality of institution is underlying how you are going to connect with other countries smoothly as well, right? Especially now when you have to do things online and digital economies on top of everything conventional trade has been doing. So the proper regulation would determine how trustability of your trade partner into your trading with your economies and how flows of goods, service, and information would flow between two countries. Plus, everything's on these institutional and mutual recognition agreements on these standards would reflect as well when you want to participate in international agreements, FTAs, modern type of FTAs, which a collection of every regulations in your economy combined and agreements that create mutual recognition standards between these two countries would require you have to strengthen institution quality to match with other countries.
Yeah.
That's my.
Yeah, thanks, Vitada. And there's a question in the chat from, the name is Bangladesh Tofael. I guess Tofael must be the name. Are you online, Tofael? And do you want to unmute if you are?
Yes, yeah, I'm
okay.
online.
So your question is relates to exactly what Vitada was talking about just now. Your question is, please elaborate on how countries with weak institutions can benefit from trade liberalization in regard to building stronger institutions. And I think this is really a really high dollar question because creating institutions or strengthening them or making them function in a more efficient way is, of course, a really, really big and very difficult challenge. What's the role of trade, if any, in that? So do you want to speak to the concerns that give rise to your question, and then we'll try to speak to that.
Yeah, just my concern was that when we are discussing about the benefits of trades and achieving the SDGs, the thing is that weak institutions actually cannot focus the benefits of trades to the appropriate way, so that the benefits that should come out of the trade to achieve the SDGs are not achieved for the countries with weak institutions. So my question is how countries with weak institutions, as you all are aware of, the countries that have actually weak institutions, can improve their institutional capacity and institution themselves to focus the benefits of trade, international trade, to enhance the capacity of the institution themselves. For example, I'll just give a small example. In our courses, we see that trade reduces hunger and trade can play an important role in decreasing inequality. But if the institution is weak, suppose the tax policy is regressive, then the whole inequality of the issue will increase in a sense. So how trade can help the institutions to improve their performance to use the benefits of trade? That was my concern. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, really good question and a very, very difficult one. I'm going to invite the panel to jump in on this in just a moment. So essentially your question is analogous to asking, okay, if companies engage in trade and they adopt ISO standards like ISO 14001 for environment, is there some kind of analogous effect from trade on institutions? So think about child labor, for example, or environmental damages. Pakistan is very much in the news this week because, of course, Pakistan's factories in Sialkot producing all of the balls being used in the World Cup, right? And While there's a lot of admiration for the success of that particular enterprise, there are also lots of questions being raised in the press about what kind of labor is being used to produce those balls. Is it exploitative? Is it using child labor? Blah, 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 these kinds of things. So is there a pathway from increased trade to stronger, for example, labor standards? And that's, I think, a really tough question. So let me throw it to the panel, and anyone who wants to can jump in on that.
Yeah, I can just like to add one point what Ian just mentioned is basically the e-commerce is also actually bringing up a lot of gig workers. I mean, the labor standard issues is also becoming very important in that case. In many countries, actually, the gig workers are not considered as laborers, so they are just considered as business partners or something like that. And as a result of that, they were denied of many of the standard benefits like social security and other things. So several countries are picking up this as a major issue because in e-commerce and labor standards are going to be a major conflicting area in coming days. Some countries are considering that existing labor laws is sufficient. Only thing you need to define gig worker as the laborer. Some countries are thinking though no new laws are required. So actually what we are seeing, the trade is pushing towards a new kind of labor standard. So that's basically the agenda here, what I understood from the question. If I go back to the point once again in the beginning, like WTO itself stands for forcing, creating new standards in most of the areas. Okay, for example, like non-tariff barriers. In case of SPSs or TBTs, you require a lot of standards, regulatory licensing. So you require institutions to control that. So WTO wants that particular kind of things. There should be a body which is controlling the agricultural standards. There should be a body who will be controlling the industrial standards, and it should be transparent and it should be as far as the country's requirement, perhaps to be aligned with the international standards. Okay, so it is very much there.
Yeah, thank you. And Alberto, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I think Alexi had his hand before me.
I'm sorry, Alexi, go ahead.
Very kind of you, thank you. So standards are important, and once standards, including ISO standards, are referenced in domestic regulations, they become non-tariff measures. Many of the times it's also the trade partners, they see specific issues in the countries that they trade with, and they try to enact legislation to try to address those issues. That's a very long discussion, but I just wanted to highlight some examples where this has fired backwards. So one example is the United States Dodd-Frank Act 2010. It was meant to stop the sale of conflict minerals, right? So there were mines there, and the idea was that these proceeds from the sales of these rare minerals were used to buy weapons and contributed to wars there. So they required certification and a non-tariff measure to import this into the United States. And so they've managed to stop that, but unfortunately, about 10 million people then lost their jobs from small artisan mining companies, and because of that, there was an increase in poverty, and the consumption of infant health care goods and services has fallen so much that the infant mortality increased by 143%. Another example, Bangladesh, since when it started, this was in the 90s, a little bit earlier. The United States was very worried that they used child labor in textile factories, particularly young girls in the factories, and they enacted a legislation which essentially prohibited imports of products that had child labor in it. good intentions. Unfortunately, UNICEF report later published that many of these young girls couldn't find jobs anymore and ended up as in prostitution. So my point here is that any legislation that's done to trade partners with good intentions must always be considering the unintended consequences that may in these legislations entail.
Thanks, Alexi. Yeah, good point. Alberto, go ahead.
Thanks, Ian. And Tafaya, thank you for that question. So I think you got at the core of what a lot of economists want to worry about, which is sort of the direction of the effect of one thing on the other, right? So we care about institutions we generally see as very important for us to materialize the benefits of trade and growth and every other things and a lot of other things. So that I think is well understood. But the reverse is a little bit interesting. In my mind, I think just getting back to sort of basics, it depends on what we're exporting. And this is going to play a big role. Let's think about in economics, there's a thing called the resource curse. It has to do a lot with exchange rates. I'm not going to talk about that. There's another thing called the oil curse. And the oil curse is this story related to sort of politics and economics. The idea is this: imagine yourself in a country where there's like a cartoonish evil dictator, right? And he's pretty bad. And suddenly he's, driving his car and he finds an amazing amount of oil. Now he can export this oil and become very, very rich. The money from the proceeds of the exports can be used radically to suppress the people. In other words, because of the weak institutions that we begin with, this type of export can make the situation significantly worse. Yeah. In fact, you could see weakening institutions as this character becomes richer and richer and richer. And, we're in a UN forum, but I think off the top of our heads, we can always think of a few countries in the world that can sort of showcase that example. Think about another export now. Think about a classic labor-intensive manufacturing export where there's a lot of workers being attracted. Now, we've spoken about Bangladesh, and I saw in the chat some people talking about Rana Plaza. These things are relevant, and there's everyone that talked about worker standards before is 100% right. But one of the things we've seen from trade, and especially in Bangladesh, especially in the manufacturing sector, has been sort of the empowerment of women who have had the opportunity to gain employment in a lot of these manufacturing places that are there. We have to remember that the labor standards that are evident in Bangladesh are not a function of trade; they're a function of poverty in Bangladesh. And so once we look beyond that, we see that there are opportunities for a lot of workers there. This can have a democratizing effect in the economy, right? As people get, higher income, greater opportunities, they will begin to demand things change for their kids, change for their society. And so here we have two stories of places that can begin with relatively weakish institutions, but depending on the type of good that we're exporting, we can have entirely divergent outcomes when it comes to sort of the politics and the institutions and how they emerge, which means that the answer to your question is really, really hard because it sort of depends where you start, what you're exporting, what you're looking at. And it's likely to vary significantly across countries, and even within countries, across regions within a country, which we can see in a lot of Africa, for example. But it's a really fantastic question because it's sort of there's no clear answer. So thanks.
Thanks, Alberto. I'm going to link this to another question in the chat, and I'm going to look to Witada for an answer for this one. So the question in the chat comes from Wajirani. And Wajirani's question is, when we consider trade linkages with the SDGs, how could it be connected with supporting development of less developed countries through trading mechanisms or agreements? What are the mechanisms that you would like to propose? And so this really this shifts the focus of the question a little bit towards what, if any, is the role of things like international agreements, especially trade agreements with behind-the-border measures on labor standards or environment or other things. Are these effective? Not just at ensuring particular behaviors like abolishing child labor, but even maybe at building institutions that would be robust or would be resilient in a broader setting. Witada, you want to have thought? You must have thoughts about that. So let me throw it to you.
Thank you very much, Ian. When talking about role of trade agreements on institutions in less developed countries, right? I think we may have to separate factors here. One is the competitive force factor, where the agreements itself by nature would try to force participating countries to ramp up their capacity to match their trade partners, because they have to sign to a common rule, common standard eventually. But of course, there will be transition period, because in almost agreements, when you have different level of development of members, you grant transition periods longer for LDCs or for smaller developed countries for them to adjust. And in trade agreements, they often come with mechanism like technical cooperations or aid for trade or something that grant additional support for smaller countries to build up their capacity. So that come with the paperwork that trade agreements embedded, right? Also, I think for less developed countries, once they participate in trade agreements, it happens as similar as the way we learn from export, that country that ready to come first would move on and then get stronger participants. So the faster they can reform their rules, their institutions, would enhance their process to further and keep it running with the benefits that they are expecting from trade agreements.
Right. So so if we could summarize that, I guess participation in global trade, especially through international architecture of trade agreements, is very effective at changing behavior, because companies want to participate and therefore they're going to apply standards that are required in order to do that. The bigger question, of course, is whether that behavioral change extends more broadly to a change in the, in the business climate, or what we're calling institutions. That it's not just about a firm with a contract of applying different standards or practices, but whether that then becomes has a chance to become a kind of a more widely accepted norm of behavior across the whole economy. That, I think, is the really hard part of all of this. But as Alberto pointed out, incomes grow, and as incomes grow, we get more demand for higher standards, for better practices right across the board. And so the indirect effects of trade, both through direct influence on company practices and indirectly through the labor market and through higher incomes, could be quite effective, although very hard to quantify, at building stronger institutions. I'm an optimist, so that's my take on this. Let's find another question in the chat here. I don't know if anyone on the panel has seen one that they want particularly to jump in and address. There's one rather intriguing one. It comes from Karian Jafta, and it's about whether SDGs assist with current freight carrier traffic harbour delays and sea route solutions that are in many instances political. This is well outside of my area of expertise, so maybe Karian Jafta, if you're online, you want to jump in and tell us what you mean by that. Oh, apologies. Are you there? Maybe yes. We can hear you. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, wonderful. The reason for my question is, especially looking at COVID and the situation of war within Ukraine, there is a lot of countries that actually were dependent on supply, agricultural supply from Ukraine, and whereby South Africa actually has the opportunity to supply these countries with agri-goods, but due to the specific routes that doesn't go via certain countries and like ship routes that I'm talking about, I think there should be something in place in cases like this as solutions for supplying these countries so that we don't sit with the situation of hunger in those countries.
Thank you, Carrie-Anne. So is this a question about infrastructure or about practices or regulations that govern who undertakes the trade and how? Which one do you have in mind?
I would say both, in a sense, due to the fact that it is like political. The freight ships, some of them don't take certain routes due to political reasons with agreements with countries, certain countries. So yeah, I would say both.
Okay, thank you. I wonder if our trade or GBC experts want to say anything about that, Biswajit or Witada? No, I think you've stumped them both, Carrie-Anne. we're going to have to think about that.
Good, because now I can be a little bit more challenging in that. You know, for small businesses like ourselves, it's really exports is important to us. So if we can have solutions in this regard, it can really up our economy within South Africa to supply these countries. So there's definitely a need for a solution when it comes to sea traffic.
Alexei, you have your hand up. Is it you want to address this question?
Yeah, just on this particular question. So when Ukraine restarted export of some of its wheat through the Turkey deal, there was a little bit of discontent because much of this wheat ended up in European markets rather as promised the African markets, and there were concerns that that's not what we agreed to. But I think these people who say that fail to realize just how interconnected these markets are. So if Europe would have not gotten this from Ukraine, they would have gotten it from someplace else, and the world wheat market would still be affected. So it's just like with the sunflower oil, that Ukraine is one of the world's biggest exporters. It ended up reverberating all the way in Indonesia, who put an export ban on palm oil exports because those are related markets. And then consumers in the world did not have sunflower oil, nor did they have palm oil as a substitute. So in terms of the solution to this, I think the first one would be to realize that, you know, if we depend on a particular partner and that partner is not being invaded by Russia, we'll be okay. That's not the case, because these markets are very much interrelated. So that's number one. So no one's safe, and there is no easy answer to this. I mean, obviously, food stockpiles, food reserves are one way to go, and many countries already do that, and not necessarily a trade policy. But I do like some of the examples I have seen in some of the Middle Eastern countries who are very much net importers, and they had food crises in the past, and they did have specific policies to deal with it. So if I'm not mistaken, it's either UAE or Qatar. They ended up buying a bunch of land in Africa. to secure their own production, which basically doesn't even go as to any other export markets. And they were very much undisturbed recently by the geopolitical events.
Thanks, Alexei. And we're going to go to BizBudget in just a moment, but I want to share a little story about the last point that you made. About a decade ago, I was asked to provide consultancy services to a Middle Eastern country. Of course, it wasn't named, but it was Qatar, that was looking to buy land for exactly that purpose. And the consultant question was, which country should they go to buy the land? And so I considered this all very carefully, and this is 10 years ago, and I said, you should get it in Ukraine. I'm glad they didn't follow my advice. Okay,
I think they ended up with Ethiopia or Kenya, was it?
I believe so, yeah. Yeah, they didn't tell me. That wasn't part of my contract to learn the answer. BizBudget, over to you.
Okay. So this is the time of disruption. So countries will try to find out a convenient way. So we really can't theorize this particular aspects. We can only look at the historical facts that, sometime back when there are disruptions, how actually countries were doing it. So that's point number one. Point number two is, I think the price will be actually taking its own course because there will be food shortages, as just mentioned by Alexei. And then countries will try to go back to their own convenient way. So that's basically the stuff I wanted to say. But from the business point of view, I'd like to say that, companies are right now trying to work on the resilient supply chain, robust supply chain. That means basically the second line of defense and second line of markets. So countries who have not diversified their exports to many markets, or countries who have not diversified their source of imports from many countries, not depending on one country, will have certain challenges. There is no other way to handle this particular stuff at this moment. Particularly in Ukraine, I had an experience of advising some of the Indian companies in Ukraine. In fact, I was there in Ukraine in 2014 when actually the problems started. So I knew some of the stuff. So to highlight one thing, as you just heard about sunflower oil, India also imports a lot of sunflower oil from Ukraine. So what I found that Ukraine is not able to brand those products. So Ukraine is actually exporting just the raw material. So there is a lack of effort in terms of value chain creation. This is one. The second point is even in 2014, the Ukraine's supply chain, the backward supply chain, was very much connected with Russia. Okay, because many of the production lines, the raw materials, intermediate goods, even technological cooperations was good. Even that time, this divide was definitely was coming up. It was very clear. So there could be many other countries also having some kind of a long supply chain with possible countries with whom there could be a future conflicts. So this is the time actually we must learn that how actually we diversify our exports as well as diversify the source of our imports. In case of edible oil, as I just mentioned, I can give you the example of India. India is actually trying to, because the per capita edible oil consumption in India is very high. Okay, so most of our foods are very oily foods, and we are not fully self-sufficient in edible oil. So new markets, new sources, maybe Ethiopia, maybe Mozambique, maybe some other countries. For quite some time, actually, the government was exploring, and there are a lot of such discussions happening. I think that's the way actually we can go ahead even in future. So there will be a cost of possible uncertainty that will be, included in the business development part. That this is the first line of supply, this is the second line of supply, or something like that. So this redundancy cost, who will bear and how it will be distributed, will be the main questions in coming days, because otherwise the world will have a sustained high price for quite some time.
Yeah. Good. Thank you. Good points. Witada, you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I just want to flag that the shocks, the delays, the scarcity in food or in electronics or in whatever markets that we saw during the crisis, is part of it is because of the crisis itself, but maybe more larger part of it is because of the other country overreact to the crisis.
Right.
As we can see, the export control, restrictions, so on and so forth. So my point is we need to have the mechanisms, ideally the WTO mechanisms, or if we cannot have that, then it's become like trade agreements, bilateral, regional trade agreements, mechanisms that prevent this kind of action. But that is the idealistic way. We try to like in the UN, we have the model provisions in times of crisis where we try to stimulate the thinkings of how we can make regional trade agreements have the preparation mechanism for such crisis. But in practice, how that works when the real crisis hit, this is still challenging.
Yeah, thank you. I want to now, yeah, exactly. I was actually just about to call on you, Pasakorn, with a different question in mind, but you've got your hand up, so let me just hand the mic straight to you.
Yes, I just would like to respond to Witada comments that because I think Witada mentioned that country may overreact, but I do disagree with her statement a little bit because I think that there is a reason that why country try to like come up with such kind of policy in response to the crisis that happened. You know, probably not really real economic reason, but sometimes the pressure within the country or political objective might play a role for them to come up with such kind of policy. You know, not really like 100% overreact, but I think it's it might be not purely economic objective. Some in some cases, you know.
Yes, so so an example of that would be a country that you may be familiar with, where where the rural electorate has a lot of influence over the composition of government, right? And in that case, rural interests may dominate economic efficiency and policy making, and that comes at a cost to overall efficiency, and of course it may come at a cost to equity as well. Now, Thailand is not unique in this respect by any means.
Yes, and another point, Ian, also that there also part of this kind of policy. If you notice that, okay, one country announced certain policy, and then within a week or a following month, you see another country announce the same kind of policy. Sometimes it is like the act of like feeling like what is the word like feeling like to miss the train, you know, like yeah.
The module that we have on health also illustrates these kinds of dilemmas at country level, I think. So in response to the COVID-19 crisis around the world, as we know, in 2020, lots of countries adopted policies that restricted trade in personal protective equipment, PPE, maybe restricted trade in various kinds of medications as well. And the consequence of that is almost certainly very unequalizing in terms of countries that have production capacity or the wealth to take measures against this disease, and countries which don't. So as you said, Pasakorn, countries kind of jumping on the bandwagon. There's almost a mass panic effect in 2020 when every country goes, we have to assure medical supplies for our own population first, and only then after that allow for any export to other countries. And we saw how that completely disrupted the market for global health products at a really critical time and produced at a global scale enormous inefficiency in trade. So from an SDG, from the perspective of the health-related SDGs, this was really a catastrophic moment, and we don't know how long-lived the effects of that are going to be.
Sorry, Ian, can I add a small point to that? Because I think it's something people sometimes don't think about, but the idea of doing that when it comes to health in particular can be particularly sort of short-sighted in the sense that if I'm building my own internal PPE capacity, especially during a pandemic, and there's some disease running around and people imposing lockdowns, there's a big chance that I'm gonna impose a lockdown in the city, and the folks that are making the PPE for me are not going to be able to make it. It just calls, to quote Biswajit point before, it's really about diversification here, how that can really solve a lot of these problems. So in the context of a pandemic, you can really see that it's a bit of a silly policy.
Yeah, easy for us to say, I guess.
I just want to add one small point here.
Yes.
After pandemic, what is going to happen in those industries? Suppose you have developed a capacity of producing 1 million PPE kit, what will happen? So, actually, I really don't have an answer, but I'm really worried about it. Can we go back to the earlier industry, or perhaps you have already developed capacity or supply chain, which is not required anymore in that extent?
Well, Biswajit, I could describe myself as an optimist, but when you say after the pandemic, I realize that you're even more optimistic than I am. I want to shift gears a little bit, and I'm going to throw this back at you, Pasakon, one more time, because you're an expert in agriculture and agricultural development in a country that occupies a very special place, I think, not only geographically, but also in terms of its economic development. So Thailand is a country which got started on rapid economic growth and industrialization very early among the countries of the developing world, and achieved middle income status or even upper middle income status quite quickly, and therefore probably has some lessons for the rest of the world, but also by virtue of its geography, is very, very closely linked now to the fortunes of the Chinese economy. And so I want to come back to a question that came from Shujat Ahmed. The question was, while looking at countries like China, where technology and innovation have been a great cause of growth, how will such ingredients help other countries to grow with a focus on trade? And I think there are two ways to kind of think about this question. One is, are there any lessons in development from the Chinese experience, or we could go back a little further and say the Thai experience with transfer of resources from agriculture to industry? But we could also look a little forward and say, okay, China is a very big economy in the Asia-Pacific region, in fact, in the global economy. And if China's policies change, particularly its policies on domesticating its own supply chain, what's that going to do for prospects for growth, for continued growth and development in its trading partners in countries such as Thailand? So two questions, really. Pasakon, you have thoughts about those?
Yes, Ian, you give me two difficult questions to answer, but I would like to touch on the point of Thailand. As you mentioned that as part of an example that we move on for our economic development from agricultural sector and become more industrialized, and right now we are at the point that everyone said that we are in the middle income trap, middle income trap, and there is among the scholars in Thailand, they often compare Thailand with Malaysia, that Malaysia already announced that they become developed countries. But since if you look at the past, Malaysia and Thailand has started at the same page. But look at where are we at right now, you know. But of course, there are stories behind that what Thailand has been experienced for the past 10 or 15 years, not only economic factors alone, but also the political fragmentation among people in the country that I think really play, from my point of view, I think really play a crucial role on that through the Thai economy. Getting back to China, I think if we look at the government policy, especially the recent what we call the new approach. If you are familiar with Thailand development economic approach, like you may be familiar with the word self-sufficiency economy that the government have been promote for several years. That like if we want to grow or we want to expand, amid the crisis, we have to have a strong immune system to protect when there is a crisis. That is the original model. But recently, there is a new approach for Thailand development that I think even the recent APEC meeting, they had put that approach into the spotlight. It's called a BCG model, circular and green economy. And I think, as you mentioned, that I think the country is heading to the direction that not only the industrial sector, but in terms of agricultural sector, I think they all agree that innovation and technology has played a crucial role. Because if we are still stick with the same stage of the development of the industry, I think Thailand would lag behind. So right now, recently in Thailand, I think that the concept, the idea of the BCG is the new development approach that they try to, especially agricultural sector. The keyword is less is more. Because in the past, we have plenty of land, but we grow only a few crops, you know. And also the other sector, especially tourist sector, you know that Thailand is one of the world popular destination, and we have many tourists come. But the problem is that our natural resource is deteriorate because many people come to exploit. And I think the government see the point that if we are going to use this kind of model, I think it's not sustainable or not last long. So they are shifting back to shifting or heading to the direction of the BCG concept that in terms of agricultural technology play a crucial role, like, and the government try to promote the smart farming concept to the farmers. I mean, it's easy to say, but it's difficult to implement this kind of policy, and I think there is a long way to go, and many things that has to work out, you know. So in order to answer your question, Ian, I think it's not easy to moving Thailand out of the middle income trap, because it's not depend on only economic factor. You have to have a good institution. You have to have a good political system. You also need to have a good policy, you know. And recently, if you see this morning on the news, I think regarding the zero COVID policy in China, you see that people right now start to protest and are not happy with the government, because they have witnessed that all the people in the world enjoy the World Soccer game, you know, and they can
Yeah.
gather, but there are people still stuck up with the strong policy on COVID. I hope I answered some of your question. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. So I think so as economists, we know that the transition from mostly agricultural to mostly industrial structure in production and employment is a very big part of the overall development process. And we can see that if trade were to facilitate that transition, that is, by taking advantage of abundant, for example, low-skilled labor, then the income effect of that trade is going to be very big. It's going to have a lot of influence over total income and therefore make it much cheaper for the country as a whole to achieve fundamental progress in the main SDGs, reducing hunger, reducing poverty, etc. But you make the very good point that all of this is conditional on politics and institutions and policies, and that therefore every country's experience is going to be colored or influenced by that. Good points. I want to stay a little bit broad. In the chat from last session, we had a question about deglobalization, I guess, or what's sometimes called deglobalization. That question came from Rajashi Chatterjee, and it was, with countries going back to protectionism rather than globalization, is the role of trade diminishing towards achieving the SDGs? And that links to another question in today's chat. Today's question comes from Wajid Hassan Shah. Given the dual blows from the COVID-19 pandemic and the Russian invasion of Ukraine causing runaway inflation in many developing countries, this is likely to mess up SDG achievements. So we're less likely to hit 2030 targets for many of the SDGs. How would we then advise using trade, I guess, if I can reword the question a little, advise rewording trade with respect to achieving the SDGs by 2030? Tough question. Any of the experts here want to weigh in on that one?
Maybe I can give it a go, Ian.
Go ahead, Alberto.
So I think this is a real tough question. In terms of deglobalization, I think we got to remember that economists are really good at highlighting the pros of trade, which we've done to some degree here. But economists have also highlighted that there's pros and cons of trade, and with every sort of policy change, there's gonna always be winners and losers, and this is always gonna be a case. And trade isn't exempted from this. So deglobalization is, I think, a function of a lot of the people that haven't necessarily benefited from trade being very vocal and getting a lot of political sway. The reason why that happens, in my mind, is associated with the fact that we've something we've been talking about before, which is that trade is not a standalone policy when it comes to achieving societal outcomes like the SDGs. It's got to be coupled with a whole bunch of other things. And if we're not doing that properly, then those people that don't benefit from trade are going to be really disenchanted by the whole system. So, and I think that can explain deglobalization to a large degree. I think it can certainly explain a lot of what happened in the U.S. Previously, which we were all following. And so, what we need to remember is essentially that trade is this engine for growth, right? So you're putting the engine in your car, and you can really hit high speeds and get there, But if you don't wear a seatbelt, someone can get a bit hurt. And so what you got to remember is that we need the seatbelt, we need the comfortable thing, we need airbags, we need the good tires, we need a good source of fuel, be it electric or whatever. The point is, you need a whole bunch of other things for this thing to actually work well. So when it comes to COVID, we have this giant shock. And then we have another giant shock with what's happening in Europe. These are supply side shocks, and because we're in a globalized economy, they get we basically all feel them. We're basically all living the market consequences of this. That doesn't mean that trade is bad. It doesn't mean we should get rid of it. It means that, there's all these, when we're driving really fast and really taking advantage of having a great car, sometimes we're going to hit a bump on the road and we can really get hurt. These supply side shocks are almost always going to happen. And I think what we need to see here is how to build resilience against these sort of shocks going forward. We've spoken a little bit about diversification, but I want to hit a point here, which is related to the high inflation that we're naturally going to get. And perhaps one of the things we need to start thinking about when we start thinking about other policies is macroeconomic policies making sense in a world where we have supply side shocks. Macroeconomic policies of the ones we're experiencing now are sort of putting the brake in that car. But because it's a supply side shock, we sort of hit a wall and then someone's putting the brake on it after we hit the wall and we can't accelerate anymore. So perhaps we need to think about how we diversify monetary policy and think about what monetary policy ought to look like in a world where we have supply side shock versus demand side shocks. And as you see, that's got little to do with trade. I think we still need the car, but we need to think about these other concurrent policies and making sure that they make sense. Now, I'm not a macro expert, but I don't particularly like the interest rates going up when we have a supply side shock. So
Yes.
I'll let macro experts attack me over that one.
I think you raise a very good point, which is that the domain of policy for ensuring stability and growth, or at least stability, is very, very broad. It goes all the way to macro and banking sector and monetary policy as well. And this is not a new dilemma, of course, because if we think back to the Asian financial crisis at the very end of the 1990s, and then the so-called taper tantrum of 2013, when the United States Central Bank announced that it was thinking about raising interest rates, and all of the countries in the developing world which that had open capital markets experienced capital outflows. Those capital outflows really restricted their potential for growth and undermined their stability at the same time. The lesson from those experiences was, if you want to prevent the car from hitting the wall, to borrow your analogy, then one way to do it is to have very large foreign exchange reserves. But of course, if you use your export earnings to produce foreign exchange reserves, then you're not using those earnings to build bridges or schools or health clinics or other things which can achieve SDG targets more directly. And that trade-off, I think, has been a very big dilemma for a lot of lower middle income countries, or even upper middle income countries like Turkey or Indonesia or South Africa, for example, have faced that trade-off in a very big way. So that takes us off in a very different direction. Let me not monopolize the time here. Somebody, Biswajit, you had your hand up.
Yeah. Okay. So I'd like to highlight two contradictory issues here. Number one, to understand deglobalization, we need to understand the phases of globalization. The 21st century globalization was slightly different from the 20th century globalization. It is mostly based on trade of parts and components and servification of manufacturing process. So
right.
Global value chain is the driver of today's trade. So that means more parts, components, as well as information technology will travel. So it's really a fragmented production system. So we can think of that our car has suddenly stopped because maybe the bridge ahead is broken. So we'll wait. So when the bridge will come up and we'll drive again. So it's not so easy to go back to the earlier systems of fully protectionist regime. So it will be somewhere in between. This is point number one. And point number two is the neoclassical trade theory does not necessarily talk about an equidistribution of the gains from trade. And this literature is well established. So a country needs to have a complementary effort for making it inclusive, and that's the linkage of trade and SDG. For example, through the global value chain, if a country is giving a huge focus on SME development, gender empowerment, digital literacy, and many other things, of course, their production side as well as the service side will be quite strong. So if you're not able to do that, then actually, maybe in coming days, there will be challenges. So during this slowdown period, maybe some countries are reworking on the policy. I'm sure most of the countries, because a lot of discussions are going on, that how we'll find out a new ways to move forward. So deglobalization, everybody knows that it is not the answer. So protectionism is basically, as everybody mentioned, is a bit of overreaction. So we are just waiting. I'm hopeful that wall in front of the car will not be there in coming days. So you can take the car ahead, but maybe in a different way. Right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Thanks, Bisoja. We face very uncertain times ahead. We don't know about the wall. We don't know much about the car, for that matter. Let me swing that. We have about 9 minutes left. I want to swing the discussion back first to environmental or climate change questions. And so, Alexi, I'm looking at you. In the chat from the previous session, there was a question which I think very relevant, both as a specific question and as an indicator of a broader set of questions about the relationship between wealthy countries and poor countries in achieving SDGs. Now, SDGs, of course, are developing country programs and targets, but the wealthy world is very much connected through a whole variety of things, including, but not only including, trade. So the question was, to solve the problem of environmental damage, can we, the questioner says, can we employ the Coase theorem? That is, should developed rich countries be paying poorer countries to cut emissions on their behalf? And what will that do for SDG achievement? So, Alexi, is that something that you'd like to speak to?
Yeah, sure. The answer is yes, 100%. The rich countries should pay for the poor countries, no doubt. And there's a bunch of reasons there. Many of the times I presented my work on the trade and climate change, participants from developing countries there clearly indicate that, yes, we understand we will bear the highest cost of climate change, natural disasters, and so forth. But we have more important things, more important priorities, right? Our people are poor, our people are hungry, our people are sick. We need to get rid of that. Yes, and we would like to obviously address climate change, but we can't afford it. And if we're going to have a choice between, building a school or putting a carbon tax on, we'll start with the school. We'll start with this hospital. We'll make sure that there's enough food. So, if you're going to leave it all the way, ask the developing countries to pay for the climate abatements. Again, that's not going to be the top priority. And I mean, from the question of fairness, most of the countries on per capita basis have a much, much smaller emissions footprint than the biggest proponents of the climate change mitigation and adaptation, like the European Union and other high-income economies. So again, yes, absolutely, they should pay for it. And in fact, I think that's one of the outcomes of the recent COP meeting, COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt,
Correct.
that they will create a fund to help the developing countries with the projects of reducing the emissions. Now, in terms of the Coase theorem, I'm not sure this is particularly applicable here for the reasons is, again, that it's the priorities are not there. I think one of the assumptions of the Coase theorem is that everybody would sort of gain the same benefits. from whatever good they're trying to buy or not. But again, the benefits for the developing countries are much less than for the proponents, the developed countries, even though the costs are actually quite much higher for the developing countries in terms of just the damage from natural disasters, people's displacement and so forth. But it's much further down the line for them relatively. Now, I think part of the question also asked whether, for example, Switzerland should pay for stuff in developing countries for emission reductions. And interestingly, there is a little-known mechanism in the Paris Agreement that allows developed countries to partly offset their emissions by investing in infrastructure projects in developing countries. And so far, Switzerland is the only country to have actually make use of this provision. So what they've done is they had an agreement with Peru and more recently with Thailand, where they provide funds for climate change mitigation projects, such as greening, more efficient, energy efficient SMEs, electric public transport. The only catch is that these emissions reductions will count towards the Swiss reductions and not the countries where they invested, which sounds good on paper until you put on an economist's head and realize that once, for example, Peru gives their carbon savings in Switzerland and they still need to reduce their emissions further, the marginal cost of that will be significantly higher. And again, it's a little bit funny because the Swiss voters, the best well-functioning democracy in the world, voted against having a carbon fuel tax on their airplanes.
Wow. Interesting. Thank you for that insight. I'm going to have to read up and think about that a lot more. That's very interesting. We have 3 minutes left, and Shujat Ahmed has been waiting very patiently. Shujat says, I have a question on institutions. May I speak? Shujat, if you're still here, please unmute and speak.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. Can I be heard?
Yes, you can. Go ahead.
Well, my question regarding institutions was focusing on Pakistan, where there are multiple trade institutions. For example, one institute is working on the tariff, other institute is working on the taxes, other is on finance, and all institutions do come up with one policy but with different angles. So is it multiple? How you're going to define the weak institution in that case where multiple institutions are playing a role in different dimensions and just putting on their fruits?
Wow. Well, I don't know. I'm going to ask the panel to back me up in a moment, but I think the initial response to your question is when we talk about institutions, we're thinking maybe more broadly than for example, a specific agency of government. We're thinking about institutions as a set of norms that regulate, for example, labor market behavior, or attitudes towards corrupt practices, or attitudes towards the conservation and management of natural resources. So a little bit broader, I guess, than the activities of a particular branch of government with a very specific mandate. That would be my initial response, at least. That when we talk about institutions, we're thinking not so much about what the Ministry of Education is doing as what is the national view on the importance of education or the role of educational supply for overall development.
Well, in simple words, I will just put my question like, is it only one cook spoiling the broth, or are there too many cooks spoiling that broth?
I think that's a great question. It's going to depend on which country you're talking about and which particular set of institutional challenges, of course.
Is okay, so that at least I'm sure tomorrow.
Somebody needs to mute their microphone. Yes. So you obviously are well placed to talk about Pakistan. If we ask you, well, what are the institutions in Pakistan which are holding back growth? What would you name?
Well, as far as tariff is concerned, there is National Tariff Commission working on the import duties, and in which they're focusing on custom duty and regulatory duty. Then there is FBR going on the export side taxes. Then there's Ministry of Finance regulating somehow some part of the policy. Then there is Ministry of Commerce having a trade policy, and then there is central bank. So
I think,
this is the
I think in the interest, since our time is up, I think in the interest of giving a quick answer, I would say that probably the one thing that unites all of them in terms of their activities and the efficiency and the fairness of what they do would be that the system of governance is the institution that really needs to be examined, right? And by examining the system of governance, we can maybe get insights into the activities of any of the specific branches of government that you've mentioned. That would be my very quick answer. I'd love to keep talking about it, but unfortunately our time is up. So we can maybe do that offline through the community, the online course community instead.
yeah,
Thank you for
cool.
your question. Yeah,
Thank
thanks for
you.
your question.
Thank you.
Thanks to all of the participants, and thanks especially to our panelists for your insights. I've learned a great deal today. I hope others have or feel they have as well. And I want to thank you all for coming along today. This is the end of the formal online course for trade and the SDGs, but the course webpage remains up, and the UN ESCAP, of course, has a bunch of related activities that are ongoing. Some of these have been posted in the chat, in the last couple of messages in the chat. So I encourage you to take a look at those. Meanwhile, thanks to everybody, and looks like we've got some closing remarks coming at us. Go ahead. Need to unmute first, though.
All right. So, hello from Geneva. Actually, it's 8:32 a.m. So I'm fully woken up now. Thank you very much, Ian, Alberto, Pasakorn, Biswajit, Alexei, Witada already left, and a few others were there. Actually, I was listening throughout while I was waking up, and it's really very interesting. So I learned a lot as well. And I really liked the discussion on the institutions, because I really have strong feelings about this link between institutions, trade, and trying to accelerate SDG implementation through trade. If you don't have the right institutions, because we are making trade policy more complicated by trying to implement the SDGs through trade, right? So you need very strong institutions to make this right. And unfortunately, that's a big weakness in developing countries. So I think that's a very fair question, and it's a question that will need to have a lot more detailed answers and discussion in the future. So on my side, for those who don't know me, I'm the Chief of Trade Policy and Facilitation at ESCAP. So I'm very pleased to have had this first course on trade and SDGs. Thank you very much to all the participants, which I understand you've been very active. Many of you have been very active throughout the course, so this is great. This is what we want to see. Please finish all the modules and give feedback on the modules to us, because we're going to improve the course as we go. Don't forget to take the quiz, so you actually get your certificates. What else? One thing I'd like to do is maybe to encourage you to also attend some future events from ESCAP we have that may be relevant to you. For example, we have an information session coming up on our regional integration and value chain analyzer, RIVA. And so if you want to learn how to use the tool and how to actually conduct evidence-based trade policy analysis using the tool, you may want to take a look at this. And I'm sure Witada will provide more information on this. We also have many other courses. This course will be done again and again. So if you've liked it, please promote it and encourage others to participate in it. And then, as I mentioned, I think we have maybe 10 different online courses that are out now. This is big thanks to COVID-19, right? Because we didn't have much online courses before. But with COVID-19, we started putting everything we had online free of charge and with certificates. And apparently, I mean, I think this is a good move because everybody liking it, so that's great. All right. So on that note, have a great day wherever you are, and look forward to further cooperation and collaboration in the future. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Jan. Thank you, participants. Thank you, panelists. See you all again
Bye.
online or offline. Yeah, okay.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.